the Sword of Damocles. A popular phrase which, since its inception, has slithered further and further away from its original parable. COVID-19 was described as the Sword of Damocles by the world's politicians. John F. Kennedy famously referred to nuclear Armageddon as the Sword of Damocles hanging by the slenderest of threads. Sargon of Akkad. Guess I'm allergic to pundits with a fallacy list longer than a porn star's phallus, sorry. Anyway, Carl Benjamin, Lord of the Cheesewanks, even made a video on the parable, accompanied by a comment section which associated the Sword of Damocles with cancel culture. Jesus Christ. In the modern tongue, it essentially means a looming threat. But when the Roman philosopher Cicero wrote his tale in 45 BC, the moral was more nuanced than that. Cicero's version of the tale centres on Dionysius, a tyrannical king who once ruled over the city of Syracuse. Though rich and powerful, Dionysius was supremely unhappy. His iron-fisted rule had made him many enemies, and he was tormented by fears of assassination. So much so that he slept in a bedchamber surrounded by a moat and only trusted his daughters to shave his beard with a razor. As Cicero tells it, the king's dissatisfaction came to a head one day after a court flatterer named Damocles showered him with compliments and remarked how blissful his life must be. "Since this life delights you," an annoyed Dionysius replied, "do you wish to taste it yourself and make a trial of my good fortune?" When Damocles agreed, Dionysius seated him on a golden couch and ordered a host of servants to wait on him. He was treated to succulent cuts of meat and lavished with scented perfumes and ointments. Damocles couldn't believe his luck, but just as he was starting to enjoy the life of a king, he noticed that Dionysius had also hung a razor-sharp sword from the ceiling. It was positioned over Damocles' head, suspended only by a single strand of horsehair. From then on, the courtier's fear for his life made it impossible for him to savour his feast or enjoy his servants. After casting several nervous glances at the blade dangling above him, he asked to be excused, saying he no longer wished to be so fortunate. Cicero read this parable as being about the anxiety that comes with power, with fame, with fortune, and that having all of these things doesn't necessarily make you happy because there's an inevitable level of apprehension which comes with it. It's a cute story, but unfortunately I've never been able to look past its biggest fallacy. The experiences of Dionysius and Damocles aren't comparable. See, Dionysius is paranoid. He imagines all of these threats to his life because he's a tyrant, but there isn't any proof that assassins have infiltrated his ranks. Damocles has proof that his life is in danger. He can see a sword dangling inches away from his face, only held there by a tenuous string. The Forgotten City, created by a modern storyteller, puts a different spin on Cicero's parable. You are Damocles in a city of Dionysiuses. You know the threat is real, you're living proof, witnessing the sword drop over and over again. Except the sword isn't a sword, it's a raging god who can turn everyone to gold. The Forgotten City is about a lot of things, and its beauty lies in the fact that what I got from the experience might not be what you get from it. It hinges on the player's desire to engage with it to its fullest. You can't pick this game up, put it down, and come back to it a month later. More than any other game I've played, it wants you to think about it in between play sessions, to consider its many interesting characters and philosophies they practice, to want to eat its central mystery, not just unravel it. It's not just a time loop game or a walking simulator, it's an escape room the size of a city. If you haven't played this game, this is as far as I want you to go in this video. Please, if you have a PC, an Xbox, or a PlayStation, you owe it to yourself and the game's 3-man development team to give this indie gem 8 hours of your time. Don't let anyone spoil it for you. There is a reason I opened this video with a drawn-out explanation of a friggin' Roman parable. The less you know, the better. No, seriously, thank you for watching this video and leaving a like, how about that? But get lost, get out of here, go play the Forgotten City. I'll see you after. They gone? Great, that means the rest of us who definitely have played the game can settle in. Because the Forgotten City wants us to think introspectively, I'll be examining some of the game's core philosophies, as well as using this as a chance to discuss some of my personal beliefs as we go. Whilst we will be discussing the puzzle design and mechanics, I'm more interested in the world building and writing with this one. Think of it more as a literary analysis this time around. So let's zoom back to ancient Rome and try to crack the code of the greatest escape room I've ever played. This is a commentary and critique on the Forgotten City.
Hey, you're alive. When I dragged you out of the river, I thought you were never gonna wake up.
A, B, C. Always be curious. It's the type of corporate HR speak which will make even the least cynical among us roll our eyes, but the Forgotten City wears this mantra on its sleeve. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre famously said that if you go through life being curious, you might be changed by what you learn. Told you we'd be discussing philosophy more directly here. You could argue that the game takes from Sartre's book of existentialism, examining the nature of existence. One of its more tangible goals is to make the player as curious as possible and maintain that curiosity for as long as you can. This is why the game is mainly concerned with cycles, planting an idea which can loop back in on itself or become self-referential later makes a player addicted to the aha moments notorious in puzzle game design. And despite story coming first, The Forgotten City is a puzzling game. The first half of our experience, however, seems to be all about contrasts, dichotomies, old versus new, light versus dark, objective morality versus subjective morality, the upper class versus the working class, Roman doctrine versus Christian. So introducing us to Karen is as natural an introduction as we could get to this idea. She embodies this contrast. The ancient ferryman, Charon, is represented as a young woman with a modern name, her dialogue even poking fun at it in the game's only crap joke. Karen's true identity is hinted at more than once here, like when she references that she dragged us from the riverbank and found some loose change in our pockets. Using the ancient coin to choose your gender and the organic way she asks us if we remember anything leading to our 4 classes is just a couple of the neat, with a capital N, ways that modern storyteller conditions the player to be thoughtful in their interactions with the game's characters. Dialogue is the name of the game with the Forgotten City, and what better way to teach the player that than by using dialogue to pick between the archaeologist, the soldier, the fugitive, and the amnesiac. This teaches the player 2 things. A, that our choices matter in these conversations, and B, that we're encouraged to stop and reflect during conversations like these. Whether it's on something practical, like do you want a health boost or a speed boost, or something more philosophical, like what constitutes as a sin, and does this line up with our own personal morality? Our call to adventure comes in the form of Al Worth. Karen tells us that her friend, Al, has got lost in the ruins behind us and tricks us into going to search for him. Classic Karen move. We gear up with a handy torch, which teaches us how we'll use objects, and set off on our quest to find this mysterious explorer friend. It's the simplicity of the opening which stands out. The Forgotten City is far from complex gameplay-wise. It juggles dialogue, exploration, and combat in a pretty disparate way, but the thinking, the considerations a player needs to make are almost a mechanic in itself. Half of this game is played in your brain rather than on your screen, so this meditative, gloomy opening is all building to one goal: to condition you to be contemplative, to ask questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? Why do we have an ancient coin in our pocket? Who's Al Worth? What's happened to him? What's his relationship to Karen? Why are these ruins built inside this mountain? Why can we only access it via a booby trap in the floor? That's 8 questions in the game's first 5 minutes, and we haven't even asked the most important one. What the hell are these golden statues? They're immediately eerie. Their arms are stretched out in a panic, or like they're begging for their lives. It looks like a psychotic sculptor has run rampant through these corridors. Alarm bells are already ringing by the time we see the soldier running to warn someone of a threat, and this burbles into the sad, golden body of Al, hanging from a noose.
The inscription was right. There is no way back. In here, there are only two options. Death, or that godforsaken doorway into the past.
Returning to this idea of contrast, the opening's crumbling pillars, shattered walls, and navy colour palette is here to evoke mystery and wonder from the player. You're encouraged to cough up the dust, look at the murals, and consider what all of this could mean. Later, when the game comes full circle and we manage to escape from the city, these visuals encourage you to reflect on how you felt before your adventure and that bittersweetness of leaving it behind. But by the 10-minute mark, the dank and gloom of the architecture is wiped away, revealing a golden, bright, cleansed trip to the past. Because of the darkness we compare it to, it makes the Forgotten City even more awe-inspiring. I'm not saying that this is unique as far as openings go. Using a before and after is nothing new, but God, it's an effective way of whetting the player's appetite. Whilst I think one of the Forgotten City's greatest strengths is how much freedom it gives you in navigating the various characters, I do appreciate the handholding here. Karen leads us to Al, whose note leads us to the portal, which leads us to Galerius, who leads us to Horatius, who can physically guide us to Sentius. By the 25-minute mark, we've learned everything we need to know about how the game works and what progress looks like. See, modern storyteller doesn't waste time with experience points or shiny things or gut. Yeah, I know, what a redundant thing to say, but what I mean is, this isn't an RPG despite picking a class at the start. It's not an action game where the primary joy comes from hacking, slashing, or shooting. Instead, progress is rewarded in a simple, clean, but oh so satisfying way, with answers. And it's satisfying because that opening has conditioned you to question so much. The entire game is about hunting for answers, both thematically and mechanically. It's your motivation and your progress marker. The more video games mature, the more I find that being the most important thing I look for in experiences like these.
Salve, friend. I'm Galerius. Mind telling me who you are and what you were doing in the Shrine of Proserpina?
Positioning Galerius as a joyful, curious face just meters from where your time loop starts is a forcible way of making the player trust him. Just like us, he's questioning, where did we come from? Why are we in the shrine? Every single loop opens with Galerius asking us a contextual question. Why are we covered in blood? Why do we have a bow? I know I won't be alone in Galerius being my favourite character, a humble farmer with a horrific past who we can rely on to immediately believe us when we tell him we're stuck in a time loop. In a city full of suspicious, paranoid people, he's the most considerate, the most trusting. Which is why Horatius is such a strong foil for our budding friendship. Galerius starts to give us a tour of the city, pointing out where the weapons were thrown, where the population gets its food, telling us to steer clear of Aurelia, good advice, but coming upon Horatius, we're faced with our first conflict of the game. Horatius tells Galerius to get lost. He's dominating and boorish, lording his power as Sentius's right hand over the common working folk. It's neat, if unintentional foreshadowing of Sentius himself. If this is the philosophy he teaches to his closest man, that there is a class system here which needs to be upheld, what sort of person does that make the magistrate? I particularly enjoy Comrade Galerius noting to us that these people, they're not like us, as he leaves us alone with Horatius, and it plants the seed early on that perhaps Galerius would make a more just leader than our current two candidates. There is, however, a small, unavoidable issue the story runs into here. See, Horatius and Galerius need to have conflict so that we can consider Galerius' status in the hierarchy of the city. We can start plotting to put him forwards for the election, a path you need to take if you're going to reach the good ending. But seeing Horatius be such a Class A dick to our new farmer friend can make the player not want to follow him to meet Sentius, who we need to meet because he explains the premise of the game to us. I watched a couple of streamers do the exact same thing I did after chatting to Horatius. We heard him out and told him we don't respect his authority, locking ourselves off from being shown the way to Sentius. This is hardly a major criticism. We can still bundle ourselves along and find Sentius on our own, he's just up the stairs. I just think it's interesting. If you give Horatius the time of day, he can come across as much more empathetic as we initially believed, but he's still an arsehole to our new pal, and first impressions after all are everything. This meeting of Horatius is where the game lets go of our hand and pushes us into the pool. We can go wherever we like, do whatever we fancy, speak to whoever seems interesting, and this structure means that the game is ambiguous in when its tutorial ends. I've gone on the record about this before, but a game's first section needs to teach mechanics, tone, rules, and fail states. But the Forgotten City's opening doesn't do this, and that's kind of the most interesting thing about the game. The tone is established, the mechanics of how dialogue works are set, but the player isn't taught what the rules or the fail states are with the clarity we would expect. Magistrate Sentius explains the golden rule to the player, that anyone who sins will bring doom to the city, but what this means, what this looks like, is intangible at first. What counts as a sin? How consistent is the golden rule? Is it even real? If it is real, how does it happen?
The many shall suffer for the sins of the one. From what we can gather, breaking the law here will anger the gods and provoke a terrible punishment.
Sentius doesn't really help matters either. He explains that they've all lived in the city for 7 months, that he's called an early election because he's a good guy who totally believes in democracy, that someone will break the golden rule by the end of the day, and that he brought you here by sacrificing himself in another timeline. All of this paints him in the most decent of lights, but we've played games like this before. The guy in charge is normally to blame, and to make matters worse, those closest to Sentius, Horatius and his daughter Sentia, are churlish, pompous and classist. He's already starting on the back foot, so who says we can trust him? How broad our options become from this point on is what really makes the Forgotten City a consistently magical experience. Just like the 10-year game it was originally modded for, that deep breath when you realise there are no expectations for what you do next is what sells the game before you've done anything that interesting in it. There are barrels of potential here. You can throw yourself off a cliff to see what would happen. You can rush off to steal something to see if that breaks the rule. You can interview the 20 people bustling about. You can just spend some time following what they do and where they go to see who sins. Despite the city being 5% of Skyrim's size, despite the fact you can't upgrade your character or change how they look, the Forgotten City gives you, I'd argue, more of that wow feeling than Skyrim ever did. Because the depth of the dialogue that's on offer here, the density of our character's story and philosophies is more than enough to keep you engaged. In the future, the Forgotten City is the example I'll point to when I tell people that bigger isn't always better. Also, if you pick the soldier class, you can shoot Sentius in his big dumb face and end the game there, so 10 out of 10 opening. Players are, by our very nature, greedy. The Forgotten City is happy to feed us. It was around my third loop, having had my day cut short because I robbed Decius, that I began to understand the frustrations our fellow characters feel in their day-to-day lives. You are, for all intents and purposes, trapped in the city. On a trail you blaze, and having the uncertainty and mystery of the Golden Rule hanging over each of your interactions makes for compelling and suffocating gameplay. Your only solace is in the time loop, which transforms your exploration into an escape room design philosophy. Typically with an escape room, you're thrown into a space given some context, like you've awoken in a hospital on lockdown and told to just go, escape. Don't ask how, just figure it out. And do you want to know what frustrates escape room designers the most? Blunt force investigation. If an immediate path isn't communicated to a player, then the first thing they'll likely do is run rampant through the space. Tear drawers out of cabinets, rip paintings from the wall, amass as much contextless information as they can in a random order. This is a valid, if not stupid, way to solve an escape room, but the Forgotten City, through the very fact you can carry items between loops, almost seems to encourage this as a playstyle. You've been conditioned to be inquisitive, to be calm, to ask questions, but if you're able to free yourself of the shackles of the Golden Rule, you can blunder about the city, committing sins to your heart's content, and you are rewarded for this. The first time the Golden Rule is broken, you're taught a piece of how the rule works, but you're also taught that Sentius is telling the truth and that he will sacrifice himself to activate the time loop. If you shoot someone in the head, great, you've now learned one of the sins. If you let Ulpius throw himself from a cliff, even better, now you know that suicide doesn't break the rule. Do you want to lie, cheat, steal? Go ahead. Every immoral act gifts you with more information. There are still stakes though. Just because the booming voice yells,
"The many shall suffer for the sins of the one,"
doesn't mean that people are turned to gold through a snap of his fingers. You need to outrun golden arrows. This does add tension to your choices. The first couple of frantic dashes back to the portal are thrilling, but I do wish there was a way for the stakes to be raised. If a Fury does kill you, all that happens is you're sent back to your previous autosave, which in a lot of cases is better for the player because you don't need to go through the early part of the day again. Dying in this game saves time. It's a bit of a catch-22 with Timeloop games. Your only useful resources that the game could take away as punishment for death are information, money, and arrows, and robbing the player of these wouldn't add much to the stakes because they're in such plentiful supply. It's not a game which is supposed to challenge your agility or combat, but a permadeath option resetting you right back to the start would be great as an option for players who want to heighten the consequences of their actions even further. In his talk, Designing Escape Room Puzzles in Escape Rooms, imaginative title, Adam Clare highlighted the 3 ways you can create an escape room: linear, multilinear, and open. Linear is as simple as it sounds. You solve puzzle 1, 2, 3, and then you get the key to leave the room. Multilinear is where there are numerous paths you can take, but it all ultimately leads to the same puzzle solution. For example, in everyone's favourite game, Outer Wilds, which also has a lot in common with escape room design, you can soar off through the universe at your leisure, solving the game's mysteries in any order you want, but it will always be funneled into that last successful mission to reach the eye of the universe. There's still just one solution to your overall goal, with lots of paths to reach it. Open puzzle design is when there are a few solutions to the overall goal. You can either defuse the bomb, which will unlock a key so you can escape, or you can set the bomb by the door and activate it early, blowing it off its hinges. If the Forgotten City's overall goal is to escape from the city, then there are in fact lots of solutions to do that. For a start, like I said before, we can kill Sentius, piece of shit had it coming anyway, or we can rescue his tortured daughter and escape with her, damning the whole city. Or we can just escape ourselves, screw it, we got the key. Or we can ask Galerius to gather everyone, set Sentius on fire and try to break out with our friends before the Furies catch them all. Or we can dethrone God and end the Golden Rule once and for all. What's so engaging about this structure is it's up to the player if they want their goal to simply be escape, or if they want it to be help everyone. The latter requires you to fully engage with all of the game, solve everyone's problems, get to know them on a spiritual level, and if you choose to make this your overall goal rather than just escape, then the game shifts and evolves into multi-linear puzzle design. We need to collect 4 plaques in any order we like to open Pluto's temple. The Forgotten City lets you choose how complicated an escape room you want it to be, with no difficulty options, no warning, just simply weaving its complex and beautifully written story in a way which asks the player, how much do you care about these people, about the injustice of the Golden Rule? Are they worth saving? Are you prepared to up the difficulty of the game to do just that? So, a quick story. Just before the pandemic, my partner and I started to really jump into Glasgow's escape room scene. The last one we did was called Prison Break. We started the room, locked in 2 separate jail cells, on death row for crimes we didn't commit. Bloody pigs, they'll never catch me. Step 1 of the escape room was to escape from our cells before jumping into the meat of the puzzle. We couldn't get out of the cell, or rather, my partner couldn't get out of her cell. She couldn't figure out the combination of her lock. Exasperated, she yelled at the cameras,
"Can you give us a hint?
and a sly voice read off a set of letters which ended up translating into numbers, the combination for her padlock. The Forgotten City has a voice to give us hints as well, but the guidance we're given is too blunt and too quick. If the game's greatest strength is in its overall structure and its character writing, its weakness is in the smaller puzzles which make up its room. Sometimes it doesn't let some of these puzzles be puzzles. Let's look at an example. We learn very quickly that Malleolus is a powerful man in the hierarchy of the city, so it's likely going to be important that we talk to him. However, he's locked himself away inside of his house. There are, by my count, 3 ways we can get in to see him. The first is Domitius, his bodyguard. He's big, he's dumb, he's dressed like a gladiator, though we don't know why.
Why? Because I am a gladiator. That's why.
Oh, right, sorry. Domitius will let us in if we find something of value. He's not interested in money, he wants something really valuable, and it's up to us to interpret what he means. If you wait until later and get the golden bow, you can turn some eggs to gold and give him those. The second way also relies on having the golden bow. You can turn the vines outside to gold and use them to climb into the house. The third way is through Ulpius. Ulpius, being suicidal, decides the only way out of his debt to Malleolus is through taking his own life. He throws himself from a cliff and crashes into Malleolus's house, opening up a convenient pool for us to jump into. Now, I'm willing to bet that very few of you on your own immediately jumped after Ulpius, or at least it definitely didn't cross my mind that he might be my way into Malleolus's house. But there's enough information here. The fact that the house is below us, the fact that there's a clear gaping hole, that a smart player might decide to experiment and lob themselves in after Ulpius. But unfortunately, the Forgotten City doesn't wait more than 5 seconds before the Whisper hands us the solution to this puzzle, telling us crisply to follow him. Now, this gives us 2 problems. A creative solution to this obstacle has been gifted to us, so it's not nearly as satisfying as it would be if we'd been able to figure this out ourselves. But not only that, 99% of players are going to see Ulpius jump before we get our hands on the golden bow, and once you get into Malleolus's house, you get the key to his front door anyway, so you can come and go at your leisure. Which means that this puzzle, this question of how do I get in there, doesn't really have 3 solutions. You get given one of the solutions so early, and because the other 2 are locked off until much later, you're not incentivized to give Domitius his golden eggs or turn the vines to gold. You can already break into Malleolus's house and shoot him in his big dumb face, all because the Whisper spelled out what to do. This happens again later when Decius locks you in the shrine of Apollo. You need to figure out how to escape, and there's just one solution this time. Use the golden bow to turn the hornet's nest to gold. Again, after a really short period of time, the Whisper hushes up to your ear and tells you what to do before you can even get your bearings. I've heard some comments that the Whisper can be turned off, but in the PlayStation version I don't know where that option is. At the time of this video, there doesn't seem to be a way to do it in the menu. It's not a wide issue, not every puzzle has the Whisper barking orders in your ear, and many of your obstacles are a lot more complex than follow him or shoot the nest. The Whisper can't help with, say, getting Galerius elected or figuring out who's harassing Virgil. It's just a shame that one of the game's bigger puzzles gets interrupted this way and renders your other options kinda moot afterwards. The ability to activate the Whispers when we become frustrated would give players the best of both worlds. It would keep the story accessible, but provide a challenge for players who enjoy puzzle worlds like this.
Stop right there. Thank you. For your service to the Empire, I'll let you live.
Now, there have been some natural comparisons between the Forgotten City and the Outer Wilds. I even referenced it myself when we were discussing escape rooms just a few minutes ago, but I think to do so in such depth is to miss the point. Because Outer Wilds is sparsely populated with characters, the knowledge you gather rarely ever changes your interactions with them, aside from, say, Gabbro, who comforts you by sharing his own awareness of that game's time loop. The Forgotten City is built on people puzzles. You use what you've learned to manipulate the characters and uncover more secrets. With the game's emphasis on choice, this can be done in a few ways. For example, there are a fair few Christians in the city, concealing their faith for fear of persecution. Octavia is the main example. She lets slip that she only worships one god, and you can capitalise on that to follow her to her secret shrine, where one of the plaques you need lies in waiting. The problem here is that the door's locked, and typically there are a few ways to get in, like Rufus trading you the key for curing his rheumatism, or just shooting Malleolus in the face and raiding his body. That never gets old. However, identifying those who are Christian is where your smarts come into play. Malleolus despises the Golden Rule and doesn't believe that his god would punish people in this way, hinting he's not a devout Roman theologist. Rufus believes that homosexuality is a sin, hinting that he doesn't agree with Roman beliefs on the gays. The Forgotten City's greatest power is in you, the player, dissecting the information you're given, not in which dialogue options you're choosing. But when I say people puzzles, that's just half of the story. The other half is all about Stop me if you've heard this one before, or skip ahead because this isn't live and I can't hear you. Two men pop into existence on a desert island. They're strangers, they don't speak the same language, have no memory of a previous life, no preconceived notions of laws or societies. On the island is one coconut tree, which every day grows one coconut. What happens next? Do the two men try to communicate? Are they immediately suspicious of each other? Do they work together and split the coconut, or does one bash the other over the head with a rock? The 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes would immediately argue that by the time the sun sets on this island, one of the men will be dead and the other will be drinking the milk from that coconut. Hobbes argued that humans are naturally without morals, that the natural condition of mankind is a state of war in which life is, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, it's rules which make us coexist in a responsible way. We aren't inherently good as creatures, we need those rules. We need consequences. Consequences like, say, damning you and all of your friends to eternity as golden statues. There's a reason that the most consistent dialogue option in the game is, what do you think about the Golden Rule? It's the biggest question that the game asks the player. What my opinion of the rule is might differ from your opinion. For what it's worth, I think it's a load of bollocks. The characters, however, don't have black and white views on if it's good or not. Some of them don't believe it exists. Malleolus and his ilk refuse to believe the proof littered around the city in the form of the statues and the writings documenting what happens. Some of them kinda like it. Fabia doesn't mind, she's just baking her bread and doing her thing. Super easy to please, and if we're being honest, she's the most inconsequential character in the game. Some of them believe it to be a necessary evil. Horatius is a stoic. He thinks everything happens for a reason and we should trust in higher powers to understand that reason even if we don't. Sentius describes the city as a utopia, and at first glance, with its vibrant glow and how lovable 80% of the cast are, the Golden Rule kinda works, at least on a surface level. The population live in, well, I hesitate to call it harmony, but maybe it's a harmony where like one or two instruments are out of tune. Yes, Decius, I'm talking about you! And some of them think the rule, even though it is real, is tyrannical in its own right. Virgil raises my favourite point, that nobody, not even a god, has the right to action collective punishment on a group. The very concept of the many shall suffer for the sins of the one is the ultimate hypocrisy. Punishing other people for the actions of one person is, to Virgil, unethical.
Then I hope you'll agree that there are only two ways of dealing with unfair rulers. The first is to leave. The second is to remove the ruler from power. And it seems leaving may not be an option.
We'll come back to that argument later. It'll get a little blasphemous, but stick with me. The Golden Rule is a riddle for us to solve. Scarred on the side of Pluto's temple in graffiti is the question, how can we pass this test if we don't know the rules? And yeah, the game wouldn't be nearly as fascinating if Sentius gave us a scroll at the start with the game's 10 commandments to follow. It forces us to question and confront those thin, grey areas we see, and each grey area peels back another layer of our own moral code and how the city reflects that.
I haven't been at my best lately. I know that. It's the rheumatism. It starts with constant pain in all your joints. Then the pain starts to mess with your head.
Rufius's homophobia, according to the game, is a direct consequence of the physical pain he's in. I didn't know this before playing, but it's commonly documented that rheumatism, like many other physical illnesses, can alter your brain chemistry, shorten your temper, and force you to lash out in ways you wouldn't under different circumstances. So, if he can't control his outbursts, how responsible is he for his harassment of Virgil? How much judgment can we pass on him? Once you cure his rheumatism, he immediately apologizes and does his best to make up for it, and despite the fact he's making Virgil's life a living hell, it doesn't seem to break the golden rule, so what does that mean? Decius has the only medicine in town which could save Julia's life. He's selling it at a marked up price because he knows that he can, supply and demand. There's a high demand for this medicine, so he knows he can get away with charging extra. In his words, that's just good business. In my words, it's deeply unethical and Decius is an absolute What separates Decius from the private healthcare like we see in the US? You could argue that you still get treated if Florida man runs you over with his car, even if you don't have health insurance. A doctor will still save your life if it's within their abilities. You'll just be slapped with a hefty fine afterwards. And yes, it would be less cruel for Decius to give Julia the medicine now, save her life, and write up a debt agreement for say 1,000 coins, but would it make his actions ethical? Really? Because if Rufius's rheumatism can be blamed for his cruelty, can we not blame the golden rule for Decius's? Nobody can steal the medicine from Decius because it would kill everyone. Nobody can cave in his weaselly little face until he gives it up. Societally, the Forgotten City's economy hasn't reached the point of inflation where anybody can pony up the coins for that medicine. Decius is taking the mick, but the environment that Pluto has created by using the golden rule encourages his greed to fester, and nobody can do anything about it. I'd be surprised if any players decided to scavenge enough coin to buy the medicine from Decius. Because we can carry items over into each time loop, the easiest choice is to just take the medicine, let the golden rule play out, and jump into the next loop. But is this ethical? I'd argue yes. Nobody suffers as a result of it. We're essentially using our power to duplicate items and coins, but if stealing at its very core is an immoral act, even if it doesn't hurt anyone, what does that say about me, the player, for not taking the golden rule seriously once I understand the mechanics of it? The rule can be exploited by us, and I did exploit it numerous times, sometimes just to ruin Decius's day. If Thomas Hobbes believes that the nature of man is one of nastiness and brutishness, and that society keeps this nature under control, French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau couldn't disagree more. His view completely contradicts Hobbes. If we return to the two men on Coconut Island, Rousseau believed that they would work together. They'd split the coconut. They would, without outside influence, enter into what he called the social contract. Probably through charades or something, because they don't speak the same language. For Rousseau, it was society which corrupted us. In our most natural states, we wouldn't even understand the concept of murder or stealing. But if a plane flew over Coconut Island and dropped a book explaining how good life would be if that other guy didn't take half a coconut every day, it's likely that outside influence would be enough to result in murder. The Forgotten City society is a corrupting influence. Decius exploits the rule and raises his prices. Aurelius sells poison, rightly claiming that it's a way out of the city, despite the fact it would kill you. And whilst we can judge these people for being the mightiest pieces of shit, you could argue that what they're doing, exploiting the loopholes and the grey areas of the Golden Rule, is an act of personal rebellion. Taking Rousseau's argument, if the Golden Rule is a corruptive framework which you don't like, which subjugates you and your people, created by an elite being which you cannot punch in the face, how would you rebel against it? You'd poke holes in it, right? And globally, rebellion seems to be one of the things the international community can agree on. The freedom to disagree with your country's leader, to protest them, and yes, chuck them out if they become a dictator or tyrant, is a fundamental part of civilization. When you can't do any of that, petty little fightbacks in your own way are as good as anything to make you feel better.
There's something dangerous about you, like a prowling manticore.
Shut up, Aurelia, I'm not defending you. Almost every conversation in the Forgotten City evolves into a Socratic dialogue of sorts. The stories we're told of the past are basically parables, though for a group of people who have literally nothing going on, they love to warn you before they regale their tale that,
well, it's a long one and kind of sad.
Oh, is it I? If anything, this endeared me to the characters more. They have some of the most interesting stories to tell, with lessons to learn and clues to the true nature of the city, and without fail, every single person warns the player that this story or that is going to take up a lot of your time. I'm in a time loop, Galerius. I've got all the time in the world, and I love you, pal. Tell me a story.
My home was reduced to ash. My sisters dead.
Oh, Galerius' story is a perfect example of this past as parable idea. He killed a man to protect his sisters. It was self-defense. Galerius isn't a violent man. He's loving and empathetic and helpful, but the Roman Empire, in line with Rousseau's Society, had a corrupting influence on his moral code. Now, typically, you'd hear a story like this and you'd feel sympathy for the killer, not the killed. The legionnaire Galerius split in half was a bad guy. The phrase, he got what was coming to him, is tossed around a lot, and it would be fair for you to hear this story and think just that. But as a result of Galerius' violence, his home was burned to the ground and his sisters were killed. How much responsibility can he bear for that? The Forgotten City doesn't pony up an answer, and it doesn't expect the player to have an answer either, but it does expect you to factor it into every conversation after the fact. Your life is directly threatened by characters at a couple of moments, such as Kabash. By the time he draws his bow on you, you've collected the plaque you need in the catacombs, and you've learned that Pluto might not be able to see what you're up to down here, so killing him wouldn't punish you, not really. An arrow in Kabash's knee would just mean, at worst, that you'd need to skip back to the portal and move on, but Kabash is a sympathetic character, and the Forgotten City is superbly immersive, both in its world design, its writing, and how gorgeous its score is. So if you give yourself over to the game, you'll hopefully think about Galerius' story of self-defense and how it may not always be the right answer. Maybe we can talk Kabash down, and the game lets you do just that. I could go on. A discussion of each of the philosophical and moral quandaries at the heart of the Forgotten City could fill 2 critiques, or 3 even, but the nature of man seems to be the question the game comes back to. Even when it's not a direct influence on a conversation or a quest, it undercuts it with depth and intricacies we rarely see in games. So with that in mind, stop me again if you've heard this one. You are travelling on a country road and come across an overturned food wagon and the corpses of dead soldiers. You note that there's a blood trail leading into the woods and decide to follow it to find out who could have done all this killing and stealing. The blood trail leads to a group of villagers. It turns out that they raided the food wagon. What a twist! Ah, but the food in that wagon actually belonged to them in the first place, and the soldiers stole it from them. They were just taking it back. Do you A, kill the villagers, or B, not kill the villagers?
Please, we're not thieves. This is our food, our crops. They took it, left us with nothing. Our children are starving.
So you repay theft with murder. A fine lesson for your children.
Yeah, you probably guessed that this isn't a famous philosophical tale, it's a side quest in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and you could argue that comparing the Forgotten City to Assassin's Creed Odyssey is like comparing a diamond to dog shit, but that game is bad, and Ubisoft haven't solved their culture of abuse, so I think Socrates would let it slide. To date, the moral choices we typically see in games which advertise themselves as having moral choices are not moral choices. There's no grey area in this side quest. Kill people who took back food or don't. Be a dick, or don't be a dick. It's a sort of moral quandary that we see repeated again and again, and while seeing the consequences of these actions ripple out through a game can be satisfying, most of the time it's homogenized design. They are just so the marketing can say it's in there rather than add any curiosity or introspection for a player. Consider Catherine, a much more interesting game than Assassin's Creed Odyssey that I am a big fan of, but it still falls into these pitfalls of discouraging deliberate thought in its choices by offering them up as binary. What's most important to you in a partner, looks or personality? Oh, thanks for answering. You're on track for the bad ending, 1011010. The Forgotten City is so much more interesting than this. Whilst your choices do matter, there are 4 endings for a reason. The game is less interested in the physical consequences of your actions and more about the thinking, the internal debate. Watch any decent streamer play the game and they will all openly debate with themselves about what to say next, what a story or argument means. And this is all saying nothing of how the game melds its philosophies with its combat. I would argue that despite the Forgotten City being so open in its design, it also follows a 3-act structure. Act 1 covers our introduction to the city, to the Golden Rule, to the people, and solving some of the low-level quests like Ulpius's death and Rufius's pain. Act 3 covers Sentius's villain turn. Act 2, which we will be discussing here, covers Kabash and Naiva's respective missions, as both are linear, removed from the main town, and combat heavy. Finding the golden bow gives the player 3 things: a weapon to fight with, traversal options which were previously locked off from us before, and best of all, further knowledge of how the golden rule works. I've mentioned this before, but to repeat, it isn't that a god just snaps his fingers. The Furies come to life and shoot golden arrows at people. If you pay attention during rule breaks, you'll be able to figure this out for yourself, but there's a solid chance that the player will get the golden bow before a sin is even committed. When you hear pretentious jackasses like me discuss Ludo narration, this is what we mean. Storytelling through gameplay, knowledge gathering, not through exposition dumps or dialogue, but through the simple act of playing the game. It's impressive that the Forgotten City takes the time to make its core weapon really damn cool, but also integral to the central mystery. It would have been all too easy to just give us a standard bow and arrow. And the bow is cool. Combat has just enough depth to remain satisfying and engaging without being distracting. Pulling off a headshot and turning a creature to gold feels great, in no small part because of the lengthy transition that you get to witness when the arrow hits them in the side of the head. Kicking over these new golden statues feels even better. However, resource management here seems unnecessary. Arrows are littered throughout the Forgotten City, whether in combat sections or not, and we can carry what we find between time loops. There is essentially an unlimited supply of ammunition in the game, and I would argue that this is never a challenge, just a distraction to add the illusion of depth. The game wouldn't lose any of its brilliance if the golden bow replenished its arrows all on its own. Navia's palace acts as a tutorial for the bow as well as a gruesome twist on the golden statues we've seen so far. Some of the statues have come loose, have come alive, malformed and tortured, and they charge you with eerie creaks and groans, which can be pretty chilling. Tonally, it's a completely different feeling from exploring the golden aura of the city itself, so no wonder the game warns you beforehand that this might not be an experience for everyone. Some players are just here to flirt with Aurelia.
You're not supposed to be here.
Navia has locked herself away from the rest of the city. These creatures which rush us are a direct result of the surgery she's been conducting, all in an effort to free her beloved Galatea from her golden prison. She's lost her mind, naming one of the statues and falling in love with it. There's a creeping paranoia as we muscle through, especially if you're playing as the archaeologist or the fugitive, because neither have any combat buffs. Some of the golden statues are safe and still, but some of them, with their bones and muscle showing, are just lying in wait to jump you. Emotionally, the palace is here to reinforce the horror of the Golden Rule. Blood soaks the walls, medical racks lie battered and stained through the halls. What we're witnessing, what we're sneaking through here, is a visual representation of the rot which grows beneath the main city's utopian glow. This is actually what the Golden Rule is doing to people. That emphasis on choice is here in the gameplay as well. Not every statue needs to be shot down with an arrow. You can trap them in rooms, turning curtains to gold, or freezing them in ponds. But strangely, the creatures seem to thank you, to beg you for release, to be healed when you turn them to gold. In Navia's palace, the lethal option seems to be what they want, so what's the right ethical choice?
I was vindicated by the discovery that beneath half an inch of gold, which is so rigid it must be some kind of alloy, is living flesh.
This is one of my favourite twists in the game. There are enough clues in the palace to tell us that the statues are actually alive, but learning that the Golden Rule doesn't kill someone, it just traps them in gold for all eternity is Bloody hell, it's a lot. It's a fate worse than death, and it paints Pluto as an unyielding and cruel god. In an effort to free the people from the statues, Naevia has been skinning real people alive because the gold fuses with their flesh. This is savage, barbaric even, especially with the crude surgeon's tools she's been using. It really seems like it should break the golden rule, but it doesn't. So does Pluto see his victims as less than human once he's enacted their punishment? I find it hard to judge Naevia for all of this. Here's why. Immanuel Kant is a complicated German philosopher, and by complicated, I mean he was a big old racist, and while his moral philosophy isn't without its problems, no moral system is, it's the one I like the most and helps me sleep at night. So, for Kant, it's not the consequences of your actions which matter, but the intention. He calls this the good will. Naevia is conducting horrific experiments on the golden statues, but she does it with good will. She's doing it to free them from these prisons.
Look at what you made me do to her. This never would have happened if you just stayed away.
Ah, but is she? Whilst you could argue that Naevia's intentions are good, freeing people from the golden rule, it's likely that she's also doing this for selfish reasons without being conscious of it. Moral intention always draws up difficulties. It seems simple on the surface, but burrow a little deeper and we fall into a tunnel of what-ifs and questions. The one I find most interesting is, how deep do we go when we talk about moral intention? Think about your gran. In Scotland, older generations typically might refer to a Chinese takeaway by using a slur. I'm not going to say it here, so let's use the word bunny. When your gran says, "Shall we order a bunny tonight?" she's not saying it with the intention of being racist. She doesn't want to hurt anyone's feelings, she's just using a word which generations have taught her is a synonym for Chinese takeaway. But what about subconscious intentions or subconscious will? At the front of your gran's mind, she believes her intention is harmless, but what if she's told in the past that bunny is a slur and she shouldn't use it? Even if her intention isn't to hurt anyone's feelings, she's been told that it does. So if she uses the slur again, she'll know at the back of her mind that it could be harmful. So that will factor into her intention whether she's aware of it or not. Just because she's not planning to hurt someone's feelings doesn't mean it's not 0.01% her will to use a harmful word, because screw millennials, she's old now, she doesn't give a damn. At the forefront of her mind, Naevia's intentions are to free Galatea, but her subconscious intention is a selfish one. She wants to be in a relationship with this woman, so is this ethical? Really? Kabash's story is also separated from the main city and also relates to Kant's goodwill. Skulking through the tunnels underground, this is where we start to explore the motif of cycles that I mentioned at the start of the game. Armed with our golden bow, Kabash's section is less combat focused than Naevia's, but there are still these peeling statues hunting for you in the gloom. It's the sound design which stands out most down here. The raspy gargling of the creatures echoes off of the rock walls with an attention to detail which I didn't expect from an indie game and such a small team.
Would you say you know the difference between right and wrong? You are an overthinker too. We're the same then. It is probably why I became a philosopher.
The hermit demands you debate him in order to get the key to the catacombs, which smoothly leads to his big reveal. He's Greek, and he's lived down here for years to escape the judgment of the Golden Rule. The Forgotten City isn't purely a Roman creation. Before the Romans were the Greeks, before the Greeks were the Egyptians, and before the Egyptians were the Sumerians. But they all follow the same mantra: the many shall suffer for the sins of the one. Our first meeting with Kabash immediately presents him as sympathetic, but frustrating. He's so stubborn that no matter what we do or say, he will always throw the Sumerian plaque into the depths below. This forces the player to leap down and see for themselves the ruins of the previous civilizations, methodically working our way backwards through history. Most importantly of all, it tars all of these religions with the same brush, the same inconsistencies, the same hypocrisies. It's not that the Forgotten City dunks on religion as a concept, but theism as a whole, asking the question, if there is a god, how omnibenevolent is it truly? Is it possible for a being with unparalleled power to be ethical in the ways we as humans understand?
You have undermined and dishonored the true god of the underworld. How did you think this would end, if not with bloodshed?
Kabash, much like Navia, technically follows the goodwill. He believes that destroying all evidence of other religions and establishing the Forgotten City as Egyptian is the right thing to do, but destroying the cultures which have come before or after his own belief system has consequences which are hurtful to, well, pretty much everyone who worships a god back in the city. But he believes this is morally just. To bring it back to Immanuel Kant, if he was in the cave with us and Kabash, he'd think that Kabash is well within his right to destroy the Sumerian tablet, but morality in the name of religion would not be an act of goodwill. For Kant, religious morality prescribes an appeal to authority. God says this is right, so it must be, and this should never be factored into the goodwill, because it removes the most important part of it, human autonomy, our ability to think for ourselves. Of course, the very existence of the Golden Rule contradicts Kant's belief. The people of the city are forced to define their moral code under the threat of eternal damnation. Whilst they have autonomy to sin or not sin, nobody knows what counts as a sin. No matter which way you look at it, it's impossible to live your life through Kant's ideology in the Forgotten City, because one thing will always be factored into these moral decisions: the subconscious will to not damn everyone through a single act. Hell, we learn that vocalizing an intention to hurt someone breaks the Golden Rule, even if you don't mean it. If we tell Malleolus that we're going to kill him, that counts as a sin, even if we have no intention of actually doing so. It's clear that Pluto polices our intentions as much as our actions. As with all things philosophical, this is getting a little muddy, so let's talk about something a little easier to understand: the city's true nature and environmental storytelling. The Forgotten City doesn't just promote our critical thinking skills. Its environmental storytelling constantly exceeded my expectations. The ruins at the very start of the game are grim and dim to set an apocalyptic tone, but what really stood out to me here was the positioning of this statue, on its knees, praying to the gods for forgiveness. It's positioned in the exact same place that Galerius stands at the beginning of every time loop. Before we even learn about the Golden Rule, we're already struck with the expected fate of the game's most lovable character to incentivize us to try to save the city. Not only this, but every time loop originates from Proserpina's temple, reminding us at the start of each loop just how important an ally she is in our quest. If somehow the player misses Galerius' interaction with Horatius at the start of the game, the hierarchical nature of the city is reinforced with a side-by-side comparison between Sentius' home and the slums. In the Magistrate's building, we see bold red carpets, marble flooring, luscious flowers, golden mosaic designs. It's got a whole 2 floors, for God's sake. Look at this. The slums are cramped together. No marble to be seen, just wood. Rooms which are barely bigger than Sentius' bathroom are stocked together. Modern Storyteller didn't have to do this. The Forgotten City toes the line between historical realism and fantasy. They could, if they wanted, have everyone live in their own separate homes and houses, and the player wouldn't know any different. After all, it's 23 people living in a wide chasm. There's more than enough room for them to have built their own spaces, but the developers wanted to constantly remind us of Sentius' power and authority.
So, you discovered my secret. So what? What are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I'll get to you soon, Sentius. The fact that the golden statues in the wealthier district are positioned so that they seem natural and artistic reinforces this. In the slums, they're stashed away in the corners of rooms, but outside Malleolus and Sentius' homes, they're the centerpiece of a fountain, adorned with beautiful foliage. Sentius clearly likes these statues, likes to look upon them as a reminder of the power he has over the people. But even Sentius is dominated by the architecture of the city. Pluto's temple and obelisk looms over us, the topmost point, so it's always in view. Despite the fact nobody can access it, every civilization, Roman, Greek, Egyptian and Sumerian, have left the temple there. A reminder that we are all under the thumb of whichever god created the Golden Rule. Proserpina whispers to us through the golden statues, but I'll never forget the moment one of them turned its head to face me, like in the Weeping Angels in Doctor Who, always watching, conscious, hinting at what we learn later in Navia's palace, that there are living people beneath the metal. Whilst we can find bags of coins buried at the bottom of the lake or hidden away in caves, the treasures belonging to the people are huddled in chests, some of which are locked. The people are precious about their coin, and the likes of Aurelia have purposefully stowed the bulk of her money away in a place where you could objectively argue you are stealing from. If her cash was just on a shelf under her counter, like we often see in games like Skyrim, taking it could fall into a grey area. Is it really stealing if it's just sitting there and nobody's around to tell us it belongs to them? Who knows, but it's definitely stealing if we need to scuttle up to her bedroom and open her chest.
Ugh, coming on a bit strong, don't you think? I take back what I said. Suddenly, I don't find you so intriguing anymore.
Modern storyteller placed the utmost importance on making sure the city had the veracity and vibe of Roman culture. I certainly don't consider myself an expert, creative director Nick Pierce said. I would call myself an enthusiast of ancient Roman history, and I know just enough to know how little I know, and that's why I eventually called in the big guns. According to the PC Gamer article this quote came from, the big gun in question was Dr. Philip Matiszak, an Oxford scholar and author who penned Ancient Rome on 5 denarii a day, a reference book which Pierce read while researching his novel. The flavour text, as neat as it is, comes with an odd caveat though. Picking the archaeologist class at the start of the game is supposed to give us extra information about the historical details of the city, but on my archaeologist playthrough, I didn't learn that much more than I did on my fugitive playthrough. No matter what you choose, you can still speak Latin, read the graffiti, and give detailed insight to some of the objects littered about. I wish there was a bit more of an incentive to play as the archaeologist. Also, did you know that carrots used to be purple? I didn't, but when my partner saw how shocked I was, she rolled her eyes. Carrots were purple. Why did nobody tell me? But my favourite piece of environmental storytelling, bar none, was Sisyphus and his boulder.
Sisyphus was a Greek king a long time ago. For daring to think he could outsmart the gods, he was given a terrible punishment.
Yeah, that's Sisyphus. Just in case you didn't clock that Charon is Charon, then stumbling across this poor guy desperately trying to push his boulder to the highest point in the city is the biggest visual hint the game can give us that we and everyone else is locked in the underworld. Orpheus is referenced as well later on, so's Hercules, but they managed to escape from the underworld in their tales, so of course they're not here. Tantalus is, the guy who was punished by Zeus to forever go thirsty and hungry despite being stood in a pool of water and almost within reach of a fruit tree. So's Ixion, but poor Sisyphus is the most obvious, and my favourite. He got stuck here, repeating the same task over and over and over again. Wait a minute, there is a reason that it's Sisyphus that's in the city. He's not the only person to spend eternity in hell. Sure, Orpheus escaped Hades, but his beloved Eurydice was left behind. Just because Reeve Carney's a bellend who couldn't trust that she was a foot behind him. Yes, Reeve, this is all your fault. I saw the musical. No, it's Sisyphus here because he's the man who most closely resembles our own experience. The entire game is reliving the same day over and over, bashing our head against steep obstacles and stubborn people, rolling our boulder of ethics to the top of the hill just to see it crash to the bottom again, forcing us to start over. The first time I felt this way was after I finally got Malleolus to step down from the election. It seemed that the golden rule didn't apply to a little bit of good old-fashioned blackmail, and I thought I'd won the day. I'd stopped Sentius from being killed. Hooray!
You're showing your true colors now, priestess. Your corruption sickens me. Domitius, ignore her. Proceed!
Well, back to the drawing board. The game uses Equitia as our confidant as we try to learn about the true nature of the city. She acts as a cheery wall for us to throw our shit against, looking to see what sticks. Her dialogue plants ideas for us to consider, setting us off to gather more information. She's the Watson to our Sherlock Holmes. And I love this. If modern storyteller were any less imaginative, their story about a tyrannical god punishing the many for the sins of the one could have easily had an irritating, stereotypical zealot for a priestess. Someone who would get in our way, or worse yet, be one of the game's villains. But no, by making Equitia useful to the player and accommodating, we're of course engineered to want the best for her, just like we are with Galerius. For me, this meant that when I learned that the two secretly love each other, I dropped everything to make sure that relationship could happen. Couple of cuties so they are. Setting the game in the underworld also applies an immediate power structure to the game's story. I've mentioned the hierarchical imagery we see throughout, but with all of our moral philosophers in mind, it's important to note just how little power we have in the city. This is, more than the real world, a god's domain. We are at an immediate disadvantage going up against a force or presence who can click their fingers and send golden statues to kill everyone. And I think that colours every moral choice differently. Do the rules of what's right and wrong change when we're under the boot of a dictator, when our very psychology is chained up and thrown into a lockbox?
The gods may be cruel, but Malleolus and Claudia are far crueler.
Julia poisons herself to escape her debt bondage to Malleolus. Ulpius tries to throw himself from a cliff edge. Neither break the golden rule, so it seems Pluto believes that something as serious and drastic as suicide is a legitimate means of getting out of slavery and servitude. What other drastic acts would the golden rule allow under these circumstances? Is suicide generally not a sin down here, or is it just because it's contextualized by the debt bondage? And the biggest question of all, what's the difference between Julia's bondage to Malleolus and our bondage to the golden rule? You can draw a clear parallel here. We're trapped in the city with no feasible way out, no walkthrough provided on how to get out of this situation. So with this in mind, let's return to Equitia. She also joins Virgil in planting a very specific idea for the player that maybe, possibly, killing God might not be such a bad idea after all. Just spitballing really, nothing too set in stone, nothing that could break the golden rule if he's listening, but yeah, and because Virgil is so sympathetic and Equitia is so trustworthy, the game uses their characterization in its favour in nudging the player towards that outcome. So, without further ado, let's talk about the ending. Yeah, I know, this isn't the first time I've titled a chapter in one of my videos, Kill God, and let's face it, it probably won't be the last, but the Forgotten City reminded me of one of the more pulpy beliefs I return to more and more as I get older. But first, let's talk about Sentius.
You and your pathetic morality. Nobody cares about your opinions or what happens, where you're from. Least of all, me.
This is a 10 out of 10 villain monologue if I've ever seen one. This reveal can come barely 2 hours into the game if you're lucky. All you need is the golden bow and the wits to find Scintilla in the cistern. I found Scintilla much later than this, barely half an hour before I unlocked the 4th canon ending in fact. Here, we learn that Sentius chained up his daughter, that he remembers every time loop just like we do, and that this is all one big Machiavellian scheme orchestrated by him just to retain his power as magistrate. This is awesome. The fact that the only person in the city who shares in our knowledge of the time loop is in fact a power-hungry sociopath is the stuff supervillain origins are made of. We are powerless against Sentius. We can't hurt him. We can't even threaten him because it resets the loop. We can hardly rally the troops and lock him away because if we lay a hand on him, even to put him in jail, that would break the golden rule. We can't even share this knowledge with the people because they'd forget anyway. Or worse yet,
all I have to do is commit a sin, and the day will begin again. Watch this. I'm going to kill you now.
With a simple sentence, he can reset the time loop. Sisyphus thought pushing a boulder uphill every day was eternal damnation, but no, the helplessness of this situation, the distinct lack of control, that's one of the most terrifying twists I've experienced in a game. Because up until now, we have had control, or at least the illusion of it. The time loop is our superpower, and Sentius, just by dint of existing, is our kryptonite. To be stripped of that strength makes us feel incredibly vulnerable. This is powerful, it's strong, it deconstructs our preconceptions of every time loop, and it's the only time the Forgotten City disappointed me. My problem was that the potential of this reveal is kind of where it stops. The potential. I don't think the Forgotten City follows through, and I think mechanically it bites off more than it can chew here. See, the game acknowledges Sentius's villain turn in 3 different ways. The first is if we rescue Scintilla. He marches down the stairs, rambles about what a good baddie he is, and then Scintilla sets him on fire. Burn, baby, burn. The second is if we confront Sentius directly after learning he kidnapped his daughter. This is where we get his fantastic fourth wall break summary of how futile any attempts would be to stop him. The third is if we try to warn Sentia that her father is a psychopath. Without a whisper, he appears over her shoulder and with a twinkle in his eye threatens to kill us, sending us into the next loop. Good stuff. And then after all 3 of these, where Sentius gleefully toys with us and it dawns that we cannot in fact stop him, the game kinda bugs out.
So that is how it's going to be. Oh well, this doesn't change anything for me. Ah, you've returned. Do you have any news about your investigation?
I think it's just too ambitious. To make this twist really stick the landing, it would need to stick every consecutive time loop because Sentius remembers everything, all of our previous attempts to thwart him, but when we jump into the next loop, he addresses us like we've never spoken before, even when we're alone on his balcony. Hell, if you return to Scintilla, he'll just stand there and let her burn him, despite having already experienced his own death at her hands. It doesn't matter how many times he's summoned down here, he's always surprised that she's standing right behind him. The game's coolest reveal also breaks it. And that's a damn shame, because I don't envy the task modern storytellers set themselves when they decided Sentius also remembered the loops like we do. They would have to essentially write, program and voice 2 versions of Sentius, pre-twist and after twist. A version which reacts organically to every interaction, spawning a chain reaction of infinite villain turns in case you decided to mess with the guy 200 different times. This isn't Sans in Undertale, where Toby Fox can type 200 one-liners accompanied by an "arr" sound. They're a small indie studio, and they've only got so much budget to pay their voice actors. It's an understandable disappointment, but it's a disappointment nevertheless, and it jarred with how magical the game had been up until this point. Before we get into the true ending of the game, I want to throw out for the second time a big, fat spoiler warning here. The title screen of The Forgotten City explicitly asks that content creators do not share any footage from beyond the White Corridor, and up until this point, I haven't. So just in case you misbehaved and somehow you found your way into the last 10 minutes of a spoilerific critique of a video game you definitely should be playing instead, this is your point of no return. I've spoiled a lot here, but I haven't spoiled everything. You can step away, play The Forgotten City for yourself, and still get so much vigor from the experience. Even with what you've seen so far, you'll hate yourself and you'll hate me for ruining this if you don't. And to Modern Storyteller, if you're watching, which you won't be, I'm sorry in advance. I hope you can let me off for sharing the ending here. I didn't want the video to feel otherwise incomplete. Ready?
And here you are.
This game gave me something no other video game has given me. The ability to, in an intelligent and polite way, tell God to go fuck himself. Not those literal words, well, I've written unfortunately, but I'm quite glad go fuck yourself isn't a dialogue option. By removing that all too simple phrase, the game forces you to confront him using words and language which you might not be able to find yourself, what with the stakes being so high. Games like Bloodborne let you kill God. Games like Persona let you yell at it a bit while you're throwing fire at it, but The Forgotten City gives the player the ultimate power fantasy. Stand before a god and tell him he's a jackass. Because Pluto, Hades, Osiris is a jackass. He represents so much which I, on a deeply, almost irrational level, hate when it comes to existentialism. He's the logical philosopher, a patronizing teacher, a dictator which relies on cold, calculating reason to justify his actions. Pluto is everything I think of when I think of God. Sacrilege, I know, but when I refer to God, I don't mean any particular God of any particular faith. Allah, Yahweh, and Christa aren't on my kill list. I just mean that omnipresent force, if it exists, which is always there, watching and waiting. The gatekeeper of the afterlife, who, after spitting us into a world filled with forest fires and cancer and coronaviruses, has the gall to wag their finger at some of us when we reach the end and say, you didn't do good enough. God, I'm letting all my demons out today. In the finale of Edgar Wright's film The World's End, Nick Frost and Simon Pegg, covered from head to toe in blood and absolutely blootered, tell a piercing ball of light which is preaching the betterment of mankind to fuck off, you big lamp. In the cinema, I had never felt more seen, until The Forgotten City's final 30 minutes. It's not a rational philosophy to embrace, but it helps me get through the day to have something intangible to pour my rage at when I'm a little drunk or a little high or when bad things happen out with human control. It's easier to blame God than it is to blame other human beings for bad stuff happening, because just like the golden rule, morality is a spider web to navigate, even if a percentage of us suck. The final challenge the game poses is a simple one. Can we convince a god that he's wrong? Especially a god as proud as this one. This isn't the god, but it's as good as, embodying Pluto, Hades, Osiris, and Nergal all in one, and he puts up a good fight. The transition from familiar ruins to a spaceship is here simply to serve the gravity of this meeting. It shows, once again, how modern storytellers understand the importance of contrast for shocking moments. Just like the dust at the beginning juxtaposing the clean sheen of the city, the bronzes and browns, beiges and golds are replaced with a crisp white. The Earth distantly spinning in the background, showing just how far removed Pluto and his race are from humanity. We're already entering the argument at a disadvantage. Pluto simply does not understand human nature, the complexities of it, the grey shades we've previously discussed. He is an absolutist to his dying breath, something which makes his hypocrisy so infuriating. We rattle off all of our evidence, listing the inconsistencies we've noticed during our time in the city, which ultimately boils down to one overarching argument. The Golden Rule creates a climate of corruption. Just look at Decius, Aurelia, Sentius, for God's sake. Pluto's punishment is creating a cycle of cruelty. We are living proof of this. We've witnessed it dozens of times, depending on how many loops we've gone through. Pluto's morality is the Golden Rule. It's not just the name the game uses for turning everyone to statues. He means the Golden Rule in the moral philosophical sense. Treat others as you'd want to be treated. He explains that it's a rule which each major religion has had some version of in the past, and it's definitely something a player will be familiar with, regardless of their belief system. After spending an entire game battling with moral dilemmas, our final boss isn't necessarily Pluto, it's the foundation for basic ethics. But the issue isn't necessarily with the Golden Rule as a principle, it's with Pluto's ridiculous reading of it, because his punishments are not consistent with the rule. Just listen to what he says when we use Decius as an example of a terrible thing which happens under his watch.
Having watched this merchant, that is precisely what he would expect from others, and he would be quite capable of paying the price anyway.
This is what we call a bad faith argument. It disguises the core point of the debate. It's where you move the goalposts while pretending you're not. If you want more examples of this, check out 80% of so-called internet debaters. Pluto specifically uses the word expect here. It's what Decius would expect the other people to do, so the rule hasn't been broken, but that's not the point we're making. The Golden Rule is treat others as you'd want to be treated. Decius on his deathbed might expect someone to withhold the medicine, but he wouldn't want them to. Pluto isn't playing fair. Hell, if we push our arguments further, he resorts to threatening to turn everyone to gold. That helplessness we felt when facing Sentius suddenly feels like a drop in the ocean compared to this. Just like a lot of the logicians we see debating on YouTube, Pluto pretends to be relying on reason.
Facts don't care about your feelings.
But he's not. His arguments are full of fallacy. He's playing dirty. And in the most human moment of the game, the player needs to stoop to his level to win. We exploit the time loop one last time by shattering Proserpina's case, stealing her crown, and jumping into another time loop to throw it at his feet. And not even the biggest, baddest Dark Souls boss has felt this satisfying to me. In a game full of impossible choices, we, a human, get to give a god a tiny taste of what that's like. Pluto abandons his underworld and returns home. The Golden Rule comes to an end, and we are returned to present day.
Hi there. Gave me a bit of a fright. Thought I was in here alone. I'm Al.
At first, it's a melancholic finish. The sad, crumbling darkness of what once was the Forgotten City, the place where our friends lived out the same day over and over again, the place where Galerius and Equitia fell in love, where Ulpius and Julia were saved from Malleolus, the place where Rufius sought forgiveness and Kabash saw reason. It's just gone. End of story.
You're finally here. Remember me?
Galerius? Galerius! Oh, how you doing, pal? Oh, look at you in your chino suits. Even after the satisfaction of debating a god and the whimsy that the city has to offer, I think it's just the downright cheese of this ending which works best for me. It's the happiest possible ending. All of our friends are here, coupled up if they need to. They've moved on with their lives in various healthy ways, caring for each other, staying in touch. Sentius even meets a grim fate by being encased in gold, but I like to think feeling happy about that doesn't make me a bad person. We even get to mess with Decius one last time, encouraging him to invest in Blockbuster. Finishing the Forgotten City, giving it the time, the investment, the introspection that it deserves, opens a player up to questioning a lot of their own belief system, but this final ending is warm and fuzzy because it does seem to have an answer to our questioning. In order to reach this ending, all you really need to be is curious and empathetic about the characters. Human nature, for good or ill, is how we ultimately defeat God, by using the knowledge we've gained, by uncovering systematic loopholes which help everybody. To end, we're going to use one last wanky philosophical quote. Might as well finish how we started, eh? In 2001, Lawrence Bloom wrote, "All genuine human caring has moral worth. Such caring, far from being a natural process, is difficult to achieve, and it is not really so common. It involves getting outside oneself, being able to focus clearly on and to know another person. To be curious." I like that a lot. Curiosity is a moral virtue. Without curiosity, I wouldn't have reached the Forgotten City's good ending. Without curiosity, I wouldn't have been able to navigate the game's people puzzles. Without curiosity, I wouldn't care about Galerius, or Georgius, or even Horatius. I would have written them off as NPCs. Without curiosity, I wouldn't be the man that I am today. And I like to think that I'm doing okay. The Forgotten City told me so. Thanks for watching, and a huge thank you to fellow creator Zoltyboy for doing the animations you saw throughout and the thumbnail for this video. His work is really cool, so I've linked his channel below so you can check out his work more directly. On screen now should be my patrons. You guys are awesome. Thank you for helping out with my new setup. That should be us ready to go with a new rig and editing software, so I'm hoping to get more experimental with the visuals in the future. Order of thanks go to Damp Gibbon again because I forgot about you last time, sorry about that, Kaze7, Uncle Mr. Bones, Alberto Calles, Stephen Atkins, Austin Hagerman, Chris Mitchell, Anais, Lee, Morgan, Princess Peach, Austin Long, Type Raz, Timo, Matthew Bendel, Dini, Zachary Powers, Andrew Munoz, Compulsory Fungus, Loar Zappelli, Dank Hank, Prospero, previously Harry and back and hotter, Nehuen Guterres Nopov, Lizzie Gale, Salvador Castillo, Alan Black, Callsign Noor, David Bedard, Ross Williamson, Derek 8, The Riftmaker, CC, Jared Helfer, Scott Russell, Graham McLaughlin, Semlin, Beth Littler, Oliver Farrell, John Foster Agg, Robert Capel, Elevator, Hector Arredondo, Rose Bernarda, Matt McCulloch, Guillermo Barreros Ferreira, Ethan, Paul W, Please Don't Blame, Chief Sweep, Jonathan Lum, Jaker, Paper Synth, Thomas Banchak, Eddie Wingfors, Reese Newton Seeley, Nicholas Here, Cakesters, Strupp, Angry Optimist, Plague Doctor, Adriana Martinez, Jana Grasfrau, Chris, Jake Kluzovitz, Long Cheddar, Jordan Halsey, Amory Selden, DB Geek, Ryan Smith, Talkster, Donis Conva, Ashley Broning, 100 Sams, Neil Dudgeon, Michael Diaz, Nathaniel Waters, Dinkin Pearson, Kyle Pears, Chris KK Mack, Seb Scott, Lonely Ronin, Crisp Bread, Zephyr Dawn, Kane Highwind, Neve Care, and Johnny Miller. You guys are fantastic. Thank you so much and take care.
It's tough to be a god, tread where mortals have not of devotion be the subject of song.